The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
A very good morning, and thank you so much for having taken the time to join the webinar. It's always a pleasure to be talking to the Red Mag audience. Over the last 1 year, we've connected very many times to discuss about the cybersecurity landscape and how things were constantly evolving in 2020. Through today's webinar, what we intend to achieve is to try and see if we can reflect the learnings from 2020 as we step into 2021. The landscape, to be precise, hasn't really changed much. It's in a way become a little more tedious than how it used to be before. Firstly, I'd like to start with a quick appreciation to all of the IT folks who made it possible for their organizations to go remote, for their organizations to be able to continue doing business. If it were not for IT, very many businesses around the world would have gone extinct. We've made it possible. We've made remote work and distributed workforce possible. In the process, we've learned a lot. Most of us had to do that sort of change overnight, literally speaking, and we've learned a lot, quite a bit in the process. With this in mind, what has changed and how can we go about tackling 2021 is the agenda for the webinar today. We see work from home being a thing of 2021 too. In fact, if I were to talk from personal experience, I still am working from home. Almost been a year now, I've been working from home. But then it has gotten a little easy from an accessibility standpoint. IT teams around the world have enabled their users to the best possible extent, but with a clause. With enablement, there are new problems that have surfaced. We have to try and understand and tackle them. The agenda for today's session is very much about what's the scenario of the threat landscape in 2021 and how is insider threat going to be a problem? Because it all boils down to answering this one simple question: while we enable our users, do we trust our users? We've given them all the access that they need. We've given them collaboration applications. We've given them platforms to interact. We've given them direct access to all the facilities that they had while they were working from their offices. So we will need to consider the fact that our users are prone to make mistakes. That's the ground rule. That's where we start with. So we'll need to see what are the challenges that we faced in 2021. The obvious one being users bringing their own devices, users being vulnerable to attacks while they are working from home, because all that an attacker sees right now is the opportunity that has presented itself. It's the perfect storm that the attackers were waiting for. Your users are working remotely, they are joining from their home networks. We know how difficult it is to keep a tab on security of your home Wi-Fi or ensure that it is up to date, up to standard. A lot can go wrong, and attackers want to make use of this exact opportunity. And it's become a little more difficult than before because with the whole advent of people being all over the place, your network security or your traditional network security, what was considered at least traditional network security, is no longer valid. Your users are your new perimeter, and this is the fundamental understanding with which we have to proceed. In fact, the Microsoft timeline right here points out the exact same thing. It's taking much more time to detect that an infiltration has happened, that an attack is underway, that an attacker is exfiltrating data, because in most cases it could be either an insider or your attacker themselves, and it's becoming more and more difficult to actually pinpoint and say this is where the attack's happening. The perimeter is extended all over the place, across countries, across geography. So how do you contemplate where to start? That's the question that we need to answer. With this in mind, we also have to take into consideration that it's an obvious thing that your insiders are going to make mistake. We've tried to educate them as much as possible. We've done that at least in the last 6 months. Still, on top of it, there are a few mistakes that are bound to happen, and there are obvious projections and obvious data pointers that prove the same. We've got pandemic themed attacks. We've got emails being sent out to employees that look COVID themed. A lot of them fall for these phishing attacks. A lot of them still click on these malicious sites and give away their credentials while they are working remotely. These remote applications or collaboration applications, they too have issues. We need to look into data loss prevention. We need to look into what files are being shared. Do we need a cloud access security broker? The questions are endless. So fundamentally, if one thing has to change, it is the philosophy with which we work, that we can't trust our users. Our insiders can and will be the biggest reason for security threats in 2021. And that's the obvious that I wanted to drive home today. We've seen scams, we've seen users falling prey quite easily for emails that are COVID themed, that pretend to have the cure for COVID, that pretend to have the vaccine information or such sort, signing up for a vaccine, whatnot. And there are others who try to make the best use of it, try to extort users of their money, try to get hold of personal information, saying that there's a fund out there, there's a relief out there that people can claim. In my country, this was the case. A couple of months back, a big financial institution took a big hit. Users gave away their corporate IDs, they gave away their social security numbers and whatnot. And the worst part is it's not just the banking sector that gets targeted, it's the healthcare organizations around the world. We saw how NHS fell prey for these attacks, and attackers will stoop down way further. They just want to make use of this opportunity. So it starts by a simple analysis. We have to get to a point where we know where our weak spots are, the obvious weak spots. Where do they lie? How do we go about changing our approach to cybersecurity by not looking at it as events anymore? We've been accustomed to SIM solutions. We look at analyzing events and try to draw conclusions, but they've become irrelevant because they're more of noise right now than actual insights that we can draw from these events, because they're all over the place. You'd be surprised if I tell you that the events that are generated by a remote user based on their interaction with the resources in your organization look very similar to that of an attacker. So how do you draw the line? So that is again a question that you need to answer. We'll also look at a couple of field notes that I have, a couple of real case studies that have surfaced, people who made mistakes and what lessons can we draw from them. We'll put together a strategy, a program that can help us essentially power through our insider threat program. And yes, in the process, we'll see how to be compliant as well all along. So, like I pointed out, it all starts with identifying. That's the first step. We need to know where our weak spots lie. Obviously, our users and everything that is connected to our users. So, how do they go about accessing their resources is the challenge right here. So, when we start monitoring their activity, we start getting insights. So, it is imperative that you start assigning value to your assets. Back in the day, back while we were working from our offices, it was simple. We had a very strong security defense in place. We had our perimeter well set and well monitored and well protected. But now it's all over the place. So how do you grant access? What rules, what regulations, what policies do you have to ensure are in place to minimize the risk on such valuable assets? So it's important that you start with a risk assessment. It's not too late. We've just started the year. Try and take a step back to see what are your riskiest assets, what are the most valuable ones, what if compromised would halt your business. That's where you start. So you identify those valuable assets, you assign a dollar value to them, and then you start figuring out who are the users who can potentially access that. That's how you get started assessing risk. You go a little further to see what network risks lies. Are your users connecting from a device, a personal device that's not patched, that has a vulnerability, that has virus already existing that can infiltrate into your system? Ask yourself such questions. So risk assessment extends beyond, above and beyond just your network resources to your users' personal resources too. So do you want to get security at an endpoint level, or do you want to get security at an identity level? So this is again a philosophical question right here. So this completely changes the way how we've been looking at network security. So that's something that we need to assess based on our setup, based on how our employees are, based on what percentage of our users are working remotely and how do they access. So these are questions that we need to answer while we are assessing risk. And through, yes, goes without saying, while they are collaborating, they are going to try and share business resources. They are going to try and share documents that are important. In fact, we see healthcare organizations facing a big deal of trouble. Telemedicine requiring users and doctors and other health care officials to be able to conveniently transfer access health records. It's becoming difficult because there's going to be an attacker in the middle trying to listen to what sort of transactions happen, what sort of records are being shared, and they'd want to pounce on an opportunity when they get hold of a PHI or a PII. That's exactly what the attackers do. And much to our surprise, the attackers have stooped down to such level that they are hindering normal business operations of healthcare organizations. So this is not just from a monetary standpoint. There are attackers out there from other countries who intend to stop or halt or make things work. So this has become more of a geopolitical thing right now. So we need to try and understand the gravity of the situation right here and see what best we can do while we assess risk. Obviously, through and through, when you have all assessments in place where you know where your risks rise, where you know where your vulnerabilities lie, you would need to start mapping a protocol to detect what can go wrong. So you can start with a simple checklist. This one right here is not all comprehensive, but can give you that head start that you're looking for. What factors to monitor? You've got all of that right there. Workstations, domain controllers that carry your users' identity access management information, databases that carry your corporate resources and critical documentations, cloud platforms where your users have newfound identities. They try to use their own identities. Bringing their own identity is a thing right now. Social identities for your applications. How do you do that? Network devices and how have they evolved? Servers, IDS, IPS, and literally anything and everything that gets connected to your network needs to be assessed, monitored, and valued. That's the idea with which we'll go forward while we are trying to detect where a potential threat could lie or where a potential vulnerability could lie. And when we go about doing it, in the last year, we've been able to learn a couple of things, which is one obvious choice that all security folks need to make: valuing behavior or user behavior over activity or event behavior. That's the idea right here. So it's become more human centric right now, the whole cybersecurity. Irrespective of the processes we try to have, there are still going to be loopholes because it's an unexplored territory, uncharted, first of its kind. We're trying to go about exploring it. And there are a couple of use cases right here that you can start by looking at. Log on activity monitoring, since time immemorial, has been a great asset for SecOps folks. Now it makes all the more relevant because your users are logging in from different geographies, different times of the day, different devices, so whatnot. That can give you a sign of what can possibly go wrong. So do take note of how your log on behavior looks like. You can go a little further, talk about things pertaining to activities on critical resources or activities on administrative accounts or critical policies in your organizations, and if there are any modifications that are made to that. So you'll at any given point in time need to have a bird's eye view on what's happening on these critical folders. If there is sensitive information, if there are policies right there, what do you do? How do you determine access? How do you restrict access? That's the question that we need to be asking ourselves. So how do you identify a risk at that level? And going a little further, privileged accounts again are a big deal. Privileged accounts that go dormant again can be a great source of trouble. Administrative accounts that are stale, that have gone idle, need to be monitored at all time. For certain reasons, organizations tend to retain these accounts, these inactive admin accounts, but still, nevertheless, we at least have to try to make it difficult for these attackers when they're trying to access. And if it's an insider that we're talking about, they're going to make it, they're going to have all the more easy access because they already know. So a simple thing would be to probably work on something like a honeypot. Rename these admin accounts and make them not so obvious. Have proxy accounts or trap accounts in place that look like the admin account but with no privileges at all. And when someone tries accessing that, just because you had a monitoring on that account, you know which was that insider. Whether they were doing it for fun, whether they were doing it with a motive, you will be in a position to pinpoint, catch hold, probably investigate and find out what was going on. That's the idea where we are trying to identify risks in our networks. And obviously goes without saying, unusual behavior with respect to volume of activity, be it number of accesses, be it the files that are accessed for the first time, be it an activity or a process that is run. So you need to know what sort of unusual behavior goes on. And obviously, since time immemorial, account lockouts have been a good way to prevent attackers creeping in. If an insider is trying to access someone else's account or trying to laterally move while they're trying to grab hold of access, account lockouts will give you a clear indication that something's going wrong. It's an alarm that you can count on, but not 100% foolproof, but you can start somewhere. It gets you that head start that you need. So if you were to identify, these are a few telltale signs. I have a 25 pointer list of telltale signs that you can look at. I probably share it at the end of the webinar, or you can write to me for the list. We'll need to start with identification. It again boils down to not just stopping there, seeing how we can identify and analyze the pattern. When it comes to pattern, like I told you, it's about what changes are happening and how are your users interacting with your resources. So traditional security parameters won't work any longer. We can't have benchmark values. You can't say 10 times someone failed logging in. That means it's a malicious activity. You don't know the behavior of remote users. They tend to behave differently while they're working remotely. It could be the time of the day either. While they're working remotely, they tend to take the luxury of logging in whenever they want. And most of the times, this looks like I said, the behavior of an attacker. So, how do you keep track and detect such activity patterns is the question that you need to be answering. You need to know and have a provision to build a threat model. That's where our focus needs to lie. And security teams must be able to distinguish between a user's regular activity and a potentially malicious activity. And that's where you start with detecting an insider threat. So you should be able to correlate such activities, and there's a lot of threat intelligence that is involved. Based on the gyan and knowledge that we've gained over the year, you can look at threat intelligence feeds, see if you can have them plugged in into your SIM solutions, and see if you can use that to your advantage to stop an insider behavior or an insider malicious attempt. That is where we go forward. And let's not just keep pinpointing at insiders with malicious intent. Obviously, there are a lot of insiders who click on the wrong emails, who click on links that are malicious, and they also are very much the reason for a lot of trouble in your company. So we're looking at such cases where attackers get that first hold of access and then literally move through your system. It becomes very easy if it's a system like Active Directory. If it's an on-prem Active Directory, all the more easy, simple PowerShell scripts. RDP isn't as safe as it's supposed to be. An attacker can very easily get hold of the list of users in your company, some PII around it, and in fact even find out where your domain admin resides. Before you know, much could happen. Credentials can be stolen, compromised, taken over, and the domain admin itself can be taken over. That's the tricky part right here. And it doesn't really stop right there. If we're talking about an insider with an intention, they've pretty much bypassed a lot of these stages that an attacker has to go through because they're already inside your perimeter. They're not outside your perimeter, they're inside your perimeter. And most cases, they also have the privileges that are required to do that recon that they've always been wanting to do. They know exactly where your critical resources lie. They know where your corporate data lies. They know what to look into and exfiltrate or what accounts to take over. So, such is the intensity and severity of insider attacks. And we don't want to end up paying a lot of money as ransom or halt our business or compromise our brand because of one such insider. So, going forward, what we'll do is we'll try and explore a few cases from the past. I've got a couple of ones right here. I've got like 5 cases. And before we get into those cases, most of the times, the reason behind such a failure of cybersecurity is the intrinsic trust we place on users inside the perimeter. So, all along, anybody inside the organization is a trusted employee. Anybody from outside is not trusted. Someone inside already has access. They've kind of gained access or earned access. That's how most of the systems work. But it's about time that we alter our perspective because an insider can be equally, or in fact, if not more dangerous than an outsider or a hacker. So we need to understand where all could things possibly go wrong because it's easy for a hacker to attack and get hold of access to your organization. So there are a couple of cases right here, types of users. I call it the M&M model. You try to keep it secure as much as possible, hard on the outside, don't let anybody in. But what about the mushy center part? You already have users inside and they could potentially make mistakes. So that's where we are headed. There are a couple of classifications that I have in mind. One is the pawn, they're at the very center. Pawns are the kind of employees who are unaware, they get manipulated into performing a malicious activity. It could probably be by downloading a malware or probably by keying in their credentials on a fraudulent web page because they are social engineered, you never know. So these users are targeted, they are handpicked, and attackers go right after them. And these are the pawns. The goofs are those who are ignorant users, or probably, in fact, even arrogant, who want to like probably bypass a security policy that you have, who do not do the best practice that you have, who haven't turned on their multi-factor authentication, and who just want to keep it simple, who wouldn't really care about what's the practice in place. So these are the guys who choose to make that mistake, maybe because of their ignorance. So these are the goofs that are out there, and probably 90% of the insider incidents are caused by these guys who do not follow the best practice that you gave, who've not set that protocol in place, who just choose to make that mistake. So these are the ones that you should be most careful about. So user education does help in a way, but when it comes to goofs, you need strong security protocols, and hence a foolproof model that doesn't really rely on a user and their behavior. That's where we are heading. I'll get to that in a bit. And then there's this collaborator. Obviously, at times there are going to be users who are either disgruntled, who already have an intention, who probably falsify their identity and have gotten to your organization long ago. These are the collaborators who will work with an outsider, who will pretend to be a legitimate user in an organization and intend to commit a crime. It could be theft of intellectual property, it could be customer information that they want to steal, or some proprietary information, or some financial records for either their personal gain, whatnot. So these are users that you need to be wary of, and having a behavior analytics really helps, because when these users try to do something fishy, you get a notification. And the lone wolf are those who definitely do it for the financial gain in it. They work with malicious insiders, they work with an intent, they intend to cause damage, they have the elevated privileges that they already wanted, and they hit your organization right at your weak spot. These are the kind of people who you need to be most careful about. So a couple of cases, a couple of insiders, not sounding too paranoid, but then it's important that we know that insiders have been probably the major cause of all these attacks that have been happening over the last 1 year. I have a couple of cases right here that will probably strengthen my point of argument. A couple of ones right here. Big names, big names in the industry. No exception to Tesla, no exception to Amazon or Shopify. All of these guys underwent some sort of the trouble or the other in the last 1 year. I'll probably like take one at a time. 2020, no bump at all. If an insider wanted to be a bad actor, they had all the opportunity to do all the mischief. In case of the Spotify data breach, there were two members of the Spotify support team. I mean, Shopify support team that who had abused their access rights on records of customer transactions. They had little over 200 to 300 customer records by which time they got contained. It was PII information, but still, since the news got out, Shopify's stock prices got down. They took a hit. The brand took a hit. That is the problem right here. One thing leads to another, and this could be more dangerous than you think. And in case of Amazon, it was one of those senior managers in Amazon who did an insider trading. They knew some information, they were disclosing some confidential financial data, and they wanted to get some personal gain out of it, but still it's not appreciated. So insiders trying to make some money out of it based on the critical information being shared outside. Take the Twitter hack. Twitter again is a classic case. They conducted a chain social engineering attack on Twitter employees. This is how it happened. And it was easy peasy for them to have stolen the credentials from an administrative tool. So this is the worst part, because Twitter, being at the helm of technology, at the helm of collaboration, they did not have practices in place. Something as simple as a TFA, two-factor authentication, would have prevented that Twitter admin accounts from being hacked. Tesla is no exception. So we've had consistent cases all through the year. These are big names, but then there are very many instances where insider attacks have proven to be far more grave for the small and medium scale businesses. Why though? Because at this very point in time, a lot of small scale businesses, a lot of medium scale businesses are finding it really hard to even sustain their business, and most of them can't look at investing into a cybersecurity tool. They already have decreased foot traffic, they already have closed a couple of shops, and cybersecurity would probably be the last thing on their mind. So it's really sad that attackers are taking advantage of these opportunities, and insiders are trying to do some damage uh, at this level to the organization. So it's important that we try and reimagine how it needs to happen. It can't be a tool. That's the fundamental point that I'm trying to tell you right here. It can't be a tool. You can't trust your users. It's about the philosophy with which you apply or approach cybersecurity right now, which is zero trust. That's where I'm getting to. So through and through, we've been able to learn that 2020 has been tricky. Identifying risks have been tricky. A couple of telltale signs, like I pointed out, uh, again, just to quickly help you recall, right after having gone through all of this, it's about time that you properly get a strategy in place. It starts with the UBA right now. When it comes to user behavior analytics, it's pretty straightforward and seems to be the only way out of the whole uncertainty that is associated with insiders. In all those five cases that we just saw, if there was a provision to track a deviation in behavior, right before the fraudster got to their target, we would have been able to stop them. We would have been able to, remove them of their privileges, and we could have stopped users from falling prey, organizations from falling prey. That's where we need to get headed. So you can start with a simple understanding of how user behavior analytics can potentially help. It can help you map the logic behind how users interact with your entities. It can help you map the behavior, the time of the day, the j- multiple factors like the location, the access volume. All of that gets tracked into figuring out what's the normal behavior for a user, and when there's a deviation, that gets notified. So a couple of cases right here for you would be the count, the time, the resources that get accessed. Pretty obvious, pretty straightforward. So after having understood this, you just don't stop by analyzing. You'd want a framework in place. You try to investigate how this goes about happening. Let's say there's this case where an anomaly happens at the time of the day when nobody's around, an anomaly at a non-business hour on a file that was never really accessed by that user before. So this is an anomaly. Again, an unusual logon activity, followed by access to a file or a folder for the first time, followed by an installation that happens, followed by trying to move laterally or into multiple instances, trying to get access, probably, in fact, even triggering an account lockout. So you should be able to map all of these because it's all about connecting the dots. When you look at just events, it's going to be a ton of them. It's just going to be noise all over the place. Knowing where exactly to look, what exactly to be monitoring, how exactly to connect the dots is the biggest challenge that user behavior analytics should be helping you solve. Lateral movement again becomes very difficult to identify if it's an insider, but if you have tracking enabled, you'd know that the user is doing a first time access on a host. So you would get immediately notified about such deviation in behavior, and you can get right to it. That's where you get forward with your detection. And when it comes to attackers going in your organization, what they try to do is they just don't try to get access. They try to install a program, they try to install a malware, and that's where you've got a detection system that says this user J has never really accessed this specific system, has never really installed a software or an executable file right here, and also there seems to be some sort of packets of data that are going back and forth. So this all gets factored in, and it becomes very difficult to manually skim through all these logs. But rather, if I were to track users, I'd have a profile for each user, and when there's a deviation, I'd be able to get right to it and stop that user from doing anything malicious. So this is probably going to be that one cutting edge technology that's really going to help us go beyond this current situation the cybersecurity landscape is posted. And yes, it doesn't stop right there. We also have users working remotely who are trying to make the best of the situation. Probably try use one of the USB devices to copy from these cloud applications. Probably back at work while working from their offices, they did not have the provision to do this. There were physical restrictions to carry a flash drive. There were restrictions that didn't let them do that don't apply anymore, and it can be a cakewalk for these users to walk in, copy these files. So we need strong DLP practices in place. Data loss prevention has to be fundamentally keyed into how files are being monitored, how files are being accessed, who's accessing files, and if you have a bird's eye view on who are the top users accessing what files, if there are critical files, who is the one who's accessing it the most, what sort of modifications are being done, any files are they being deleted in bulk, are they being attached to emails, all such useful insights can really give you that head start against an insider with a malicious intent. So now we've been talking about insiders with malicious intent. What if that insider had privileges? He or she can cause a lot more damage. If they were a privileged user, they could use their privileges to do a lot. They could have more accounts created. They could probably get more of their hackers inside the organization, and by the time they're all over the place scrolling, trying to exfiltrate data, probably even covering their track if they are privileged users. So this is what we need to do, being able to track privileged user activity, and if there's an abuse, if there's a first time privilege use, if there's an unusual volume of changes to GPOs that are done, account lockout policies being modified, passwords being changed, whatnot, all of that needs to be tracked. And fundamentally, a machine learning algorithm can help you do this. And AI can give you suggestions. So that's where cybersecurity is headed. Identity security is going to take center stage, and it's not going to be possible without all these integrations in place. Your SIM solution has to work in tandem with your CAS solution, with your identity access management solution, and your data loss prevention. All of these moving parts are going to come together to help you stop, be it an insider or a hacker, from trying to do something malicious. That's where we're headed. So obviously, right after you detect something is going on, and if it's an insider, since they're already in, time is of essence. Being able to stop them then and there is the biggest challenge. So you should have principles and practices in place, protocols that get triggered right after there's a deviation that's noticed, right after there's some sort of anomalous behavior. You should be able to do a pre-programmed stop. That's the idea right here. And if you can terminate their session, maybe something as simple as that, or lock their account, or it could definitely work. It could get buy you some time, because most of these cases, these insiders get in, get out with all that data they want very quickly, because it's just a matter of them executing it and leaving. So we need to be ahead of them, and that can be possible with a user behavior analytic solution in place. We'll go a little forward, try understand a couple of events. We've been talking about what sort of behavior to look into. This screen right here, probably you can grab a quick screenshot, has a list of events that can potentially give you that head start if you're looking at. If you are a fan of logs, skimming through them, making interpretations, feel free. But these ones are the most important ones. Log on activity 46244625, Active Directory logs that can tell you a lot of story, that can tell you when exactly are your users logging in. If there were multiple failures of log on, you would get notified if you have tracking enabled on this. So if you can get back and turn on auditing for these logs, it would be fantastic. We've got group membership changes that need to be monitored. Again, if someone's trying to do a privilege escalation right after they get hold of an access, these are the event IDs that can give you that head start. Account lockout monitor at 4740. Object and file access 4663. So you want your users to be on tab all the time when they're accessing a file. It could be both for success, it could be both for failure or modification. You need such information. And if someone's trying to cover their track, they are going to try and erase all of their event logs. 1102 is that event that's going to give you that head start. So I've got a lengthy list of events that you can monitor, do write to me. All critical events, again, a 25 long list of events that you can monitor, you can audit, and it can probably give you that head start against that insider. So these are events that you can audit and monitor. So we'll go a little further. We'll try and see if we can derive or get to a point where we have an approach, because all along we've tried to understand a couple of things. We've tried to identify where our threat lies. We've also tried to detect behavior. Now we need a practice or a philosophy that can really help us stop them from going any further, and hence zero trust approach. Now, zero trust is almost about a decade old. Forrester, they were the ones who first got it into the picture. Different names, but all of it leads to that one spot where you don't trust your users intrinsically. That is the fundamental way to get ourselves, ready for the battle against insiders. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We've got a couple of pointers right here. I'm going to break down zero trust approach for you in a few tenets. I'm going to give you action items around how do you go about enforcing zero trust, and yes, a couple of other points that go along with the whole zero trust philosophy. So when it comes to zero trust, like I tell you, fundamentally, every aspect of your network has to be accounted for. You need to know where your critical resources lie. You need to start by micro segmenting. You need to know which ones are important. You need to know which ones are business critical, which ones are machine critical. You will need to segregate such data and have list of people who can access that data. And every access that is made at an individual level has to be earned. You have to have certification mechanisms, or you have to have certifications done at every session basis. You can't predefine any of these rules ahead of time. You can't say if this is the user, they get access, ready access to it all the time. So you need to have a system that ensures by default there's least privilege on any resource in your organization. It's a best practice, again, the least privilege approach. What would probably work in your favor is having systems like just in time access and just enough access. They call it JIT and JIA. So if you can have them implemented, you would be sure that nobody gets more access than they require. Because in most of the cases, while we work remotely, we've seen this happening. A lot of users tend to accumulate or hoard more access than they actually require. They demand access for applications that they're never going to use. So do enable monitoring, have a system in place that regularly audits who uses what applications, and the time you realize someone's not using something, do relieve them of that access. That's something that you can go about doing, and have a workflow system in place. All permissions and all privileges need to be accounted for. If you're going about, let's say, doing a delegation in Active Directory, giving someone some privilege, most of the time the challenge is to keep a tab on it. They get that access and they never really, they just keep accumulating access. So you need to have a system that tracks such accesses that are being given. So a workflow mechanism where a request, review, approval process can really help. And beyond just access being granted to users, if you can verify their authenticity through authentication, if you can continuously authenticate your users, nothing better than that. Because most of the time, if it's an malicious insider, the points that I just covered before are going to help. If an account is compromised, you need authentication, extra factors that potentially determine whether the user is who they claim to be or not. So it's going to be a continuous process. And Gartner had a model similar to zero trust that ties in very well, which is the Carter model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick screenshot of how zero trust works in action. Where does it start? What do you do? How do you anticipate? How is it a cycle, is what we try to understand right here. So it starts with assessment. You need to have a provision to understand where are your risk vectors lying. So that's where you start. So to prevent an attack at a given point in time, you need to ensure that you're able to predict what's coming your way. So like I told you, it's a feedback loop. So you first start with discovering what are your requirements. You need to make an inventory of all the assets you have, who are the users who've got what access. You then go on to establish certain principles and policies to define who gets what level of access. And in this case, it can be adaptive access, which is a trend that's picking up, adaptive authentication and adaptive access. And then right after they get that access, how do they go about accessing those files? How do they interact with your resources? If there are deviations that need to be detected, this is where it happens. And right when such a deviation is detected, since you know their past behavior, you can adjust your risk vectors. You can ensure that the response is immediate. You can have an automation trigger and to stop that user from proceeding further. So you have an incident response also in place. So through and through, you'll have to understand that there are many verticals working together. You have data loss prevention working together. You have network security in place. You have ITOM in place. Compliance also coming into the picture because you have full-time monitoring on. You're reassessing your posture and continuously looking into visibility right here. So setting up this starts with that fundamental understanding, which is not to trust your user and to monitor them at every level. And some user wanting access should earn that access. That is the simple ground rule right here. So as simple as that, this continuous visibility and assessment model can help you manage against a potential insider threat. So when you go about implementing it, this might seem like a lot of information. How do you put it to use? One simple thing is to fixing your perimeter. Your perimeter or your security is only as strong as the weakest link. In most of the cases, the first line of defense when an attacker is trying to infiltrate is passwords. You can start looking at password policies. This might seem very basic, but turns out in 2020, most of them were identity thefts, synthetic identities being infiltrating into organizations and the ones existing being compromised. Look at strengthening your password policies. Look at solutions that can go beyond the basic password policies, help you stop users from setting weak passwords, passwords that are dictionary words, passwords that are predictable patterns. This might seem simple, but it can get a great deal of your cybersecurity push that you wanted, stopping users from being compromised. So set up password policies that aren't basic, that aren't out of the box. Look for ones that can enhance and strengthen password policies. And if you can do them at multiple levels at every touch point, even better, right at the logon screen, while they are accessing remote devices on their mobile devices while they're accessing network resources. If you can strengthen password policies, nothing better. It would be even better if you can stop your users from using obvious passwords ones that are easily guessable. So look for solutions like Have I Been Pawned? It's an extraordinarily useful resource. You can check with this integration to see if your users use compromised passwords. So see if you can tie your IAM system with Have I Been Pawned. Does it stop right there? We want to have a foolproof mechanism. Just passwords, just strengthening them isn't never enough. So MFA, multi-factor authentication, comes into the picture. So we will want to understand to see how can we make it effortless for our users. There's Face ID, there's Touch ID. People carry their mobile devices all the time, so a mobile authenticator or a time-based OTP would work. I'm personally not a big fan of text-based OTP sent. That's not a big or a good way of securing. MFA becomes void when you do that. But in my opinion, there are other factors that you can consider. Look at the flexibility of your organization, because while you implement such a technology, there's going to be resistance. And most of the times now, MFA adoption can be a little more easier because your users are used to it. Multiple applications that they use on a day-to-day basis have MFA in it. So try and implement an MFA without fail. This is a mandatory checkbox, no doubt about it. So ensure that. What more can you do right here is what interests me, which is adaptive authentication. Now that we have machine learning, now that we have AI working in our favor, analyzing your user behavior, drawing profiles for them, it's fascinating to use that to also grant access to people. Can I make it adaptive? Can I ensure that there are these basic risk vectors that a user needs to check? If the user falls within the risk score, they get access. If not, I'm going to make the authentication a little more difficult. That's the future of authentication, adaptive authentication. It takes into factor the device from where they're logging in, the location from where they're logging in, the network reputation score, the IP address. Many factors, many such biometrics get taken into account. And then based on how a user meets the requirement, uh, hits the threshold, they either get immediate access or they get blocked. That's how you go about having zero trust. So by default, you don't trust anyone. You look into parameters, you look into factors. If they satisfy those criteria, that's when they actually gain access. That's how it works. And when it comes to what happens later, if you want to mitigate a threat, your threat response system has to be instantaneous. We will need a practice in place that can kind of shorten your investigation cycle. So, threat analytics again can make a big difference. It has to all tie in, right? You need to have systems that inform you real quick, let your users know what they should be doing at that point in time. And if there's an automated workflow informing the right stakeholders, you can make your decisions real quick, let the right users know, let the right admin or let the right security folks know so that you can act right on it. That is how you go about having an incident response plan. Especially if you're putting together one, you need to ensure you do a full on evaluation. In fact, I'd recommend you do a couple of test runs to see if your incident response plan is spick and span. That's how you go about planning one, especially if it's an insider. Most of the time, it's very unpredictable. Hence, taking all that precaution that's needed. And when it comes to going to that very last leg, if all else fails, right, you need your business still going on, and you need a very strong backup policy, something that is foolproof. I usually suggest the 3-2-1 backup rule. Works like magic most of the time. You make 3 copies of all your critical data, store 2 of them in 2 different storage media, and store one of them in a different geographical location altogether. If all else fails, you definitely have one of these backups to help you get back on track. So that's how we go about defending. So we try our best to fight against insiders and external hackers. If all else fails, this rule really helps. So through today's webinar, I've tried to cover quite some ground. I've tried to give you use cases. I've tried to help you understand what are the assets that you need to be looking into, what are the behavioral patterns that you need to be analyzing, what sort of practices should you be employing if you are looking at a cybersecurity philosophy, how good zero trust is. And one of my favorite and all-time functional principles is the guidelines or the framework that was given out by NIST. It works like magic if you're looking to put together an insider threat program. If you're trying to seek budget for the program, this really helps. If you just get this aspect answered, you get the whole insider threat program up and running. So you've got this cycle. You start with identification, protection. You get to the point where you detect what's wrong. You have your response mechanism, and like I told you, your recovery. So what we covered today can be summed up in this little cybersecurity framework right here. So you get to the point where you have a bird's eye view on every asset that is critical in your organization. You know what is the risk that is associated with it. Do you have a strategy to counter that? That's the first part of it. When it comes to protection, how do you set your access policies? Who gets what access? How are you going to ensure that your users are educated to do the right thing, to make the right choice while they're online, while they're using company resource? How do you get a data security system in place? What sort of DLP rules do you maintain? How and when are you going to implement these procedures, and at what level, and what protocols are going to be implemented? That's again something that you need to answer. And when it comes to detection, after all this, when you try to detect a user behavior, how do you do it? Do you use ML and AI? How do you detect anomalies? What sort of security responses do you have right after you detect something? Is that automatic? Can it be analyzed and can it be tracked back to the source? Can you contain the damage that it causes? Can I quickly recover just in case if all else fails? Can I communicate to the right stakeholders and get things going? So these are the kind of questions that you need to be fundamentally answering in 2021 if you are thinking about putting together an insider threat program. So 2020 has been one such year where we've been able to learn a lot from experience, learn a lot from the organizations who faltered in putting together a program. Insider threat protection is definitely of top priority for 2021. I honestly hope today's session has been somewhat helpful in getting you in that direction. Thank you so much for having tuned into the session today. I'm going to be available to take the questions on email. My email ID is right on screen. So, through today's webinar, we tried and understand the landscape in 2020. We tried and used the learnings of 2020 to reflect into a strategy for 2021. Yes, you've been a lovely, lovely audience. I'm open to take questions at my email ID right there on your screen. You've been a lovely audience. You all take care, stay safe. Talk to you real soon. Thank you so much.